Hello, fellow book lovers. It's Elina, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I read 6 books in January. Let's talk about them in this January reading wrap up. Let's go through some of the stats real quick. Like I said, I read 6 books. I had 2 DNFs. I will not be talking about the DNFs in this video. I will probably make a separate video after maybe 6 months or so about the DNFs that I had so far this year. My average rating was a 3.92. I read a total of 2,472 pages. The longest book I read was 464 pages, which I feel like is not that long. And the shortest book is 352 pages. And then the genres that I read 3 sci-fi books, 2 literary fiction, and 1 fantasy. The first book that I read this month was Court of Winter. This is by Krista Street, and I ended up giving this book a 2.5 star rating. I was definitely entertained in the beginning of the book, but that kind of disappeared at some point, and it was just filled with cliches, tropes. This is definitely the most average romantasy book I have ever read. It just felt like this book took all the general romantasy elements without really adding anything new. And then as the book went on, there were actually quite a few things that were annoying to me. There were plot holes, things that just didn't quite make sense, things that felt a little bit dumb, and I didn't really like the main character all that much. I didn't think there was too much depth to her. She didn't feel very different from your general romantasy main character. And I thought she sometimes made some stupid assumptions and decisions. I will give one example of what I mean with it felt a little bit stupid. It felt a little bit dumb. And this is the thing that definitely annoyed me the most in these books. It is enemies to lovers. And one thing that I will say, I do appreciate that they were actual enemies, because sometimes that's also a critique point that I can have in a enemies to lovers story, that the enemies aren't actually really enemies. They were actual enemies, and she had a reason to be pissed at him because he murdered her parents and brother. Honestly, I find that not very redeemable. So I was already a little bit like, I don't know if that's redeemable. I feel like the only way you can redeem that is if he was forced, or if it was some sort of misunderstanding and he didn't actually do it or something like that. But the point I was going to make is what really, really annoyed me was that it was constantly mentioned that he murdered her family, which is obviously not a problem in and of itself. It was just constantly mentioned in relation to her finding him attractive, and that just gave me the ick. I don't even think I can count the amount of times that this happened on one hand. I actually don't think I can count it on 2 hands, where it's her thinking, oh, he's so attractive. Oh, but he murdered my family, so I shouldn't find him attractive, but he's so attractive though. Oh, but he murdered my family. That constant back and forth, and I just felt it was a bit maybe even tasteless, like murdering your whole entire family. That's quite a big deal, I'd say. And it just felt like they took the emotional depth out of that by constantly putting it next to her finding him attractive and putting it in that context. She would actually refer to him as the murderer of my family a lot in that context, and it was just a bit weird. There were even some not spice scenes, but tension for sure. In those scenes, even she would refer to him as the murderer of my family, and that just didn't really sit well with me. And I thought it was just odd, and it made me uncomfortable. And what I also didn't like is that I feel like the murdering of her family was used only in this sense, and we didn't actually see her grieve all that much, even though it had only been a year. And sure, she mentions once or twice that she misses her family, but it doesn't really go any deeper than that. And I just thought it was just so obvious that that was used only to create conflict in the relationship. And I didn't like that at all. And also, there was no reason for her to go from enemies to lovers other than she found him attractive and he did a nice thing once or twice, but also he still did so many things that were horrible. So It just didn't make any sense to me. I was entertained for parts of it. That's why I gave it a 2.5. Otherwise, it honestly would have been a 1 star. After this book, I definitely felt like I was getting into a reading slump. Honestly, I had already been feeling that way for a couple of weeks before I even finished this book. So this obviously didn't help that. And I thought, what better way to try and get out of a reading slump than rereading my favorite series? So I decided to pick up one of my favorite series of all time to do a reread, and that is the Thousandth Floor trilogy by Katharine McGee. So the first book in the series is The Thousandth Floor. Then we have The Dazzling Heights. And the third and final book is The Towering Sky. This is a sci-fi young adult series, but honestly, I feel like that genre doesn't really encompass what the story is about. It is mostly very drama-filled, kind of giving Gossip Girl. I will just tell you the synopsis of the book. So this book follows 5 different POVs. We follow Leda, Rylin, Avery, Eris, and Watt. And they all live in a massive 1,000-story tower. So this book is set in the not super distant future. It takes place in the year 2118. And this massive tower basically holds all of New York. So in this tower, you have everything that you can think of. Literally, even Central Park was picked up and moved inside the tower. So Central Park is somewhere in the middle of the tower and they just transported it inside. And they have all these little tech things that make it seem like you're outside when in reality you're inside. So that's just a little bit about the setting, but there's so much more to it, to be honest. In the prologue of this book, we see that a girl falls off the roof of the tower, and then we jump a year back in time and we follow from 5 different POVs the different events leading up to this girl falling off the roof. So we follow 5 different characters, and I love the characters in this book series, so I'm going to talk about them. And I decided that since I am talking about 3 books instead of 1, I can take 3 times as long talking about them. That makes sense, right? I just really want to talk about it because, like I say, it's my favorite series. Okay, so we follow Leda, who just came back from rehab. We follow Avery, who lives on the 1,000th floor. And Avery is mainly struggling with the fact that she is a custom order baby. So she was genetically created from the gene pool of her mom and dad to be like the most beautiful and perfect that she could possibly be. And she is in love with her adopted brother. This is obviously frowned upon, so she cannot tell anyone. Then we follow Watt, who has a quantum computer that he built himself installed in his brain. And this quantum computer is basically a sort of AI, and because she's in his brain, Watt and the computer can communicate through his thoughts. And he is the only person in the world, I think it is implied, that has this, because quantum computers are actually illegal in this version of the future. And Watt is actually quite poor, and so he does hacking jobs as a side hustle using the computer in his brain. And Watt is actually my favorite character, I think. If I have to pick one, I do think I would pick Watt. He is just so funny and cool, and I just love him. And I love his robot as well. His robot is very sarcastic and funny and just makes these sarcastic comments to him all the time, and it's so fun. Then we have Rylin, who lives on the 32nd floor, and I don't think I mentioned this before, but the higher you live in the tower, the richer you are, and vice versa. So Rylin is actually quite poor, and Rylin's parents have both passed away, and so she has to take care of her younger sister by herself, and she is mainly struggling financially, and that is what her story is about in the beginning. And then we have Eris. Eris lives a very rich and privileged life up tower, but then at the very beginning of the book, some family disaster happens and she has to move down tower, and she basically loses all her money and her house, and she has to get used to a completely new standard of living in the very, very bottom of the tower. So that's a little bit about all 5 characters that we're following in this book. Honestly, there are so many events that I have not told you now. Obviously, I also don't want to because it is so much more fun if you're not spoiled. But the rest of the book, we follow all these different characters as their lives intertwine. And there are quite a few twists and turns that obviously I will not say anything about. I just love this entire trilogy. These characters feel so real to me. and I really just feel for all of their problems and I want all of them to be okay. I love the diverse set of characters as well. We get some perspectives that are up tower, very rich drama kind of POVs, but then we get a few characters that are living down tower that are struggling with financial problems and things like that. So we really get both sides and also see how these characters interact with each other, because those characters living down tower actually sort of accidentally end up in the up tower world because of the events that happen. There's definitely a lot of romance in these books, but I wouldn't say it is a romance book because there's so much more going on than just the romance. So I'd say it's more like a heavy subplot of romance. And then a lot of it is about friendship and about family and just characters going through all sorts of problems, really, and interacting with each other. It's just impossible to say what this book is about, I feel like, because so much different things happen in all the different POVs. But ultimately, it is just about young people struggling with friendships, relationships, family. And then obviously there is a sort of mystery element as well with the girl falling off the tower. I love the setting of this book. It's very interesting. It is futuristic and it is sci-fi, but I wouldn't say it's very, very sci-fi. It definitely doesn't feel very much like a sci-fi book, if that makes sense, because we have nothing like set in space or dealing with science in detail. It is just a futuristic world with a lot of technological elements that create the setting. It's more a futuristic backdrop, and we get a lot of fun facts thrown in here and there about the technological advancements that have been made in between now and 2118. I would definitely say it's a sci-fi because there are some technological things that have an effect on the plot, but it's not very science-y or anything like that. I think the robot living in Watt's brain is really the only element that actually affects the plot very directly, and all the other technological elements are more just the backdrop. The characters, I feel like I already mentioned so much about the characters and I love them so much, but I just want to say the characters are very complex and layered and kind of morally gray oftentimes, which is something I also really love about this series. So basically, it is Gossip Girl-ish in a futuristic world, and I love it and I absolutely recommend, and I will not stop talking about this until every single one of you have read this series, because it is, like I've said so many times, one of my favorite series of all time. So I feel like I mostly talked about the first book. Obviously, I cannot really say anything about the plot of the second and the third book, but what I will say is that the second book adds a new POV, which was very interesting, and the romance in this book is one of my favorites, and it's so, so good. So when I say romance, like I said before, it's more like a subplot of romance. And then the only thing I can say is there is a twist in here that just blew my mind the first time I read it, and I love it so much. I honestly don't think I can pick a favorite. I rated all of these 5 stars. Obviously, I already knew that I was going to rate them 5 stars, or pretty much already knew, because I do think I've read them 3 times now. But yeah, like I said, I gave all these rereads 5 stars. So just a little bit about rereads. I do count rereads towards my reading goal, but the only thing is I don't count the ratings of rereads in my stats and in all my reading journal things. So when I say things like average rating of the month or average rating of the year eventually, that does not include these books. But when I say I read 6 books in January, or when I say I read this many books at the end of the year, then that does include these books. So that was all about this series. I feel like I've talked so long about this, but I just love it so much, and I just had to give a proper synopsis because I feel like I've mentioned this series so many times in other videos. I've mentioned that this author is one of my favorite authors. I've mentioned this series in a tier ranking video before, and I never really gave it the time and effort that it deserves, where I actually talk about the synopsis, so I'm glad that I did that. And I really hope that I've convinced someone to read this now. The next book that I read was Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I ended up giving this book a 4.25 star rating. It had a very interesting and gripping and addictive beginning, because in this book we follow a character named Joan, and she is an astronaut. In the very first scene of the book, we are immediately put into a very action-packed scene of a disaster happening in space. Joan isn't actually there in space, but she is on the, I forgot what it's called, but basically it's her job to communicate with the people in the spacecraft. And then in this first scene, we do not find out how this disaster ends at all. No, we jump back in time 7 years, and then we follow Joan in her journey of becoming an astronaut. And then we also get to know all the characters that are involved in this space disaster. And so basically, Taylor Jenkins Reid is just being quite mean and showing us that all these characters are possibly going to die, and then showing us who they are and making us care about them. And then at the end of the book, obviously, she returns to the space disaster and we find out more details on what actually happens. So the majority of this book definitely follows Joan in her journey of becoming an astronaut, and it focuses on her relationship with her fellow astronaut candidates, and it also focuses quite heavily on her relationship with her sister and her niece. That part I really, really loved. They were such wholesome scenes. So, like I said, I really, really loved the plotline of her sister and her niece, and Joan as an aunt is just so amazing, and I really loved seeing that part of her. I also really, really loved the astronaut plotline. I thought it was super interesting, and I think it was done very well that because she is becoming an astronaut for the first time rather than her already being an astronaut, you kind of get introduced to that world with the character, which is good because I don't know anything about being an astronaut. There is a romance plotline as well, and I will say the romance in this book was way more than I thought it was going to be. Even though maybe that's my fault, because it does say atmosphere, a love story here on the front cover, but just based on the synopsis and based on some reviews that I had heard, I didn't think it was going to be so much of the book, and it definitely is. So before you get into this book, just know what to expect. Just know that the romance is definitely a very, very big focus of this book as well. And I wasn't a big fan of this romance. I definitely did like the two characters together, and there wasn't necessarily anything wrong with the romance. I just think the balance was a bit off for me. I would have preferred to see more space-related things and a little bit less romance. The ending of this book really, really gripped me. I definitely did not know what was going to happen. I feel like it really could have gone two different ways, and because of the rest of the book, I really cared about these characters, so I was super emotionally invested, definitely on the edge of my seat, definitely crying all the way through. Definitely stayed up until 3 a.m. to find out what happened. So yeah, the ending definitely got me. And so ultimately, this is not a 5-star because I reserve my 5-star ratings for books that I have no criticism on, but it was definitely a really, really good book. So I ended up with a 4.25, and I would absolutely recommend. And the last book I read this month was Beartown by Fredrik Backman. I gave this book 5 stars, and so this was my first 5-star of the year because I do not count my rereads in that because, like I said before, that feels like cheating. I already knew they were 5 stars, so this was my first 5-star that I found in 2026. Needless to say, I absolutely loved this book. It was very highly anticipated for me, so I'm so glad it actually lived up to the hype. This book, and I don't know if this goes for every book by Fredrik Backman because I have only read this one so far, but this book definitely has a very unique writing style. We follow, honestly, so many different characters that I don't even know how many different characters we follow because this is written in third person and we jump from character to character all the time. So sometimes you will read a paragraph from one character and then the next paragraph we suddenly follow a different character. And so even within a chapter, we often jump back and forth between different characters. It kind of feels a little bit like you're a fly on the wall. And because we follow so many different characters, it definitely feels like we follow the entire town. So this book, if I had to describe it, I would say we follow a town, and in that town, hockey, ice hockey, is very, very important. And the ice hockey team is so important to so many different people in this town. Fredrik Backman explains it in the beginning of the book from all these different perspectives why ice hockey is so important, and it actually says things like, ice hockey, it can't be that important, right? Well, actually, blah, 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 blah. And I just feel like I cannot explain it in the way that he does. So you'll just have to take my word for it. He actually manages to make you understand why everyone in this town cares so much about an ice hockey team. So, ice hockey, definitely the topic of this book, but ultimately it's really just about the different characters and the way they respond to different situations, the way they care about something, and the way that they are affected when something that they care so deeply about maybe is jeopardized in some way or things aren't going the way they want them to go. So, about 30 or 40% into this book, some sort of disaster happens. And because this is on the night before the big hockey game, this affects the hockey team. And by affecting the hockey team, it affects almost everyone in the town. And the town sort of gets divided in having two different opinions on the matter. And I cannot really say anything more, but I hope this gives some sort of idea of what the book is about. The thing that happens, I will not say what it is because it is not mentioned in the synopsis, so I do feel like I'm not supposed to mention it, but it is quite a heavy thing, so maybe look up trigger warnings for this book. The plot of this book is just so well thought out. The way that the thing that happens, it feels so weird talking about it like that, the thing, but I can't say what it is, but it's so important that I have to talk about it. So anyway, the thing that happens, the way it affects all the different characters, I feel like that was so well done. And what I love is that the ice hockey team becomes actually such an important component because the way that these different characters are connected to the ice hockey team makes that the ice hockey being such a big deal in this town makes the disaster even more of a disaster than it would have been otherwise. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I cannot make this make sense without saying what it is, but I don't want to say what it is. So just take my word for it. It is so well written, it's so well thought out and well plotted, and the characters have so much depth. And I find that very impressive because of the amount of characters that you follow. But he really does manage to make you care about all of these characters. It was just so good. I definitely couldn't put this book down. I stayed up again until 2 or 3 a.m. to finish this book, and I went to the bookstore the day after to buy part 2 and part 3 of this book. I didn't go straight into them, but I definitely will be picking up those books soon. So if you want to see my thoughts on book 2 and book 3, they will definitely be appearing in probably the next reading wrap up, or if not then, probably the one after that. So those were all the books that I read in January. I definitely did a bit more reading than I talked about in this video, but that's because I read like 600 pages of an 800-page book. So that book will appear in my February reading wrap up and not in this one, even though I read the majority of it in January. And I also DNF'd a book after reading 400 pages of it. So for me, it feels a bit weird. Like I finished Bear Town, I think on the 19th of January or something like that. And it's the last book in this wrap up. So that feels odd to me, but it's fine. It's okay. 6 books is not a bad number at all. So that was my reading wrap up for January. I hope you had a fun time watching this video. If you have read any of these books, please let me know your thoughts about them in the comments. If you disagree with me, if you agree with me, it doesn't matter. I want to hear your thoughts either way. And I also hope to see you in the next one. Bye!